Hello there, and a very warm welcome to this week's episode of Mullooly Matters, the latest in our series on the European housing crisis, brought to you in association with Renew Europe. I'm your host, Eoghan McArdle, and I recently had the pleasure of speaking to Tony Reddy, the founder and chairman of Reddy Architecture and Urbanism, a practice whose work specialises in major commercial developments and high-scale urban design. I spoke to Tony at the multidisciplinary Housing Action Exchange organised by Ciaran Mullooly MEP and Renew Europe in Galway, which brought together public and private practitioners, industry professionals and community voices for a frank solution-based conversation about what must happen to tackle Ireland's current housing crisis. Over the years, Tony and his firm have been responsible for some of Ireland's most significant contemporary projects, including the Aircon building, Custom House Square and the Houston South Quarter. Alongside his own practice, Tony has played a major leadership role in the profession, serving as president of the Royal Institute of the Architects of Ireland and helping to shape thinking on sustainable housing and communities. He is also a founding director of both the Academy of Urbanism and the Urban Forum, organisations dedicated to promoting high-quality, people-centred urbanism. In our conversation, we discuss the shortcomings in Ireland's planning system which are holding back effective housing projects, Tony's views on Ireland's recent Housing Commission report, and the culture change and commitment needed in Ireland's local authorities to transform our housing policies. I started off by asking Tony what his key message is when it comes to the problems with Ireland's planning systems today.
The key message I would give is that both Britain and Ireland are now outliers in the world planning system, in that they now are the only countries in Europe and indeed most parts of the Western world that have that discretionary system. So the rest of the world has moved towards a zoning system. And what does that mean? In Britain and Ireland, you make planning applications for individual sites, and assuming that the zoning is correct, there's then a decision about whether you go ahead. So what that means is that each individual site is a battleground for everybody. In general, in Europe and now in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and even the United States, the planning system is one where the city or town plan tends to provide a lot more information than we do with our discretionary system. In our part of the world, you have a written document, very little visual information. It's a kind of a policy document. In the rest of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, etc., you actually have a physical plan. Now, using modern methods, you will often have a digital copy of the city into which new development is put. So what I'm advocating is that we should move to that because it gives much greater certainty. The best example, what I gave in my talk today, was that as chair of the Academy of Urbanism some years ago, I visited a number of countries in Europe. And what was fascinating was we met with the councillors in individual cities, and particularly in Copenhagen and Aarhus, the second city. And you had a political system there with 13 political parties from ultra-right, ultra-left, much wider spectrum than we would have in this part of the world. But the interesting thing was that the councillors were unified in regarding the city model and the city plan as their plan. Whereas in Ireland and in Britain, there's a battleground on each almost individual site. And it's just not a good system. It's oddly enough, it's not the way in Ireland. Our planned towns or the Dublin of the Wide Streets Commissioners was not done that way. The medieval towns of Italy or the Roman or Greek towns were not done that way. They were all planned. Mm-hmm. And so I'm advocating that we go back and we go towards a more planned system. That would give greater certainty to everyone, whether it's a local resident or a politician or a developer. Everyone knows where the city is planned to grow and there's a general acceptance.
How did we get to this point though? How did we get to that Ireland seems to be an outlier now that we haven't moved on?
Well, it isn't. It's a very odd thing. Actually, I did a lot of research on this, and what actually happened was in 1947, Britain brought in a Town Planning Act. It's a roundabout way we came at it. And what happened was that as that Labour government, it was a Labour government brought that act in, it had brought in a whole series of new towns legislation. I think there were 12 or 13 new towns. And what happened is, as they were nearing the end of their term and they were afraid of going out of power, they were afraid of all that being repealed. the moderate Tories and the moderate Labourites, then you had a much bigger centre in Britain than you have now. They agreed with each other that the Tories would not repeal the new town. As it happens, they built no new towns for the period they were in until 1964. They didn't stop them as they were underway. But the quid pro quo was that all private planning became discretionary. And in Ireland in 1963, when we brought our Planning Act, there wasn't exactly a great grow for the concept. Yeah. So it suited everybody that we had that. And in both countries, in the early days, it kind of worked. But now what's happened is all sorts of legislation has layered on it, and it has just become a minefield. I mean, it's now no longer pleasant planning a city; it's a battleground all the time. In Britain and Ireland, you now have kind of stop-start planning, and it's not coherent. It's random. I mean, I often give the example of Copenhagen. Since 1947, Copenhagen has had a city plan that's like your hand. And now above that is a sixth finger. And each of these fingers is where the development occurs, and the green here are the lungs. Every child knows what the city plan is. Everyone knows where the building will occur. So there isn't this kind of debate over it. The tragedy with the system we have is Dublin had originally planned four fingers, but we actually got web fingers. And basically, there's no faith in our planning system. So that's why I advocate going to the European model. And I think what's happening now is maybe initially some developers might have wanted that laissez-faire system. I think the general view of almost everyone now, whether it's local residents or developers or politicians, I think there's a recognition we'd be better. Some time ago, I wrote an article for the Irish Times. It was meant to be a pro, for and against. When I wrote it, Robin Mandel, who's an architect colleague of mine, who tends a defendant and somebody who was involved in opposing development a lot. They both wrote about the system. The Irish Times rang us up after and said, both you're meant to be for and against, but you both reached the same conclusion as to what we should do. And I think that kind of summarised both ends of the spectrum. There's a recognition the current system doesn't work.
In terms of the planning system as it is at the moment as well, it was brought up in today's event that who would want to work in the public sector as a planner?
It's very difficult. I mean, I think most of our planners are very hard-working. But the reality is that the image one might have, most citizens would have, that a planner is planning the city. The reality is most planners are dealing with planning applications, everything from house extensions to housing estates. And they're dealing with a lot of grief from councillors or from the public or from neighbours. And again, a lot of that arises out of the nature of our system. It's kind of an irony that, when one colours a map, which is what we do in this part of the world, as opposed to planning the physical form, it becomes a basis for everyone then argues about it. And the poor planners are the ones in the middle, and they never get much time to forward that.
So would your recommendation be at the moment for the government to the councils to let planners get on with their job, to let the professionals do what they want to do?
Well, to do. In my talk today, I showed what a typical planning department in Helsinki or Copenhagen would be like. First point I was making was that typically about 2/5, like 40% of a planning department in Europe would be involved in development control. Most of them are involved in planning. So my advice would be, I think it's going to take some time in Ireland to get the staff to build it up. But if we're to do it, there's nothing major required in our planning laws to do this. This is a different way of doing it, but the planning laws don't prevent it. But what it would mean is that we would probably have to bring in help, not just national expertise, probably international. The specific recommendation I've made is that the government should give funds to local authorities to allow them to plan in this way. So they would hire in help. They'd be doing it. They'd be in charge of it. And their planners would lead it, but they'd have outside support to get it done. And the example where that idea came from was I was in Helsinki in February, And it really hit me how far behind we are. That I saw a group, we were actually allowed to join them for a day. They were working, it was a multidisciplinary team. They were working on a piece of the city that didn't yet exist in their docklands. And they had come together because two different teams had been working on two elements of it. But the service under the streets, none of which existed, that they worked out the street widths, the street height, the building heights. Everything was planned. And not the detailed design, but the master plan. But the services didn't work, and they were there to resolve that. And they were saying this would take them some weeks, and that they were going to have to. This was for August 2030,
Right.
and they said this mix-up had delayed them, and they were now going. They were so committed to meeting the program, they were now going to have to get outside help. So that's where the idea of getting outside help came from. But this was for a planning system that is so definite that they will meet their needs. They'll meet their housing needs, very significant numbers, but they'll meet it on target because they're committed to the target and they have the methodologies to allow them to do that. Whereas we don't have plans, like we often find sites that are zoned that don't have services, or there are problems with the service. That's part and parcel of development. Really, all I'm advocating is you bring all these things forward.
Significant there that you mentioned in the example you gave of 2030. It's the golden date for us as well, 1,000 permissions needed.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was funny. I think I mentioned that during the talk. They actually said we're at August 2030. What month are you at?
Yeah.
We said we were at about 1900, and that is probably true. Really.
Exactly. Housing Commission report that was released this year. How did it make you feel after you had a read this?
Well, I thought the Housing Commission did really, really good work. I was surprised that our Department of Housing came out so quickly, having said it had read it and consulted it, and that it gave the impression many of these things were underway. I think there is a need within our political system in Ireland to we probably need greater degree of self-awareness and of self-criticism. There almost seems to be a policy of um, blandly just avoiding criticism or self-criticism, and I think that stops us from addressing problems. My reaction to it was when I read it, I was asked by some colleagues in the department, and I said, I think we need a modern day Ken Whittaker with a modern Lamass to deliver what's in the Housing Commission report. Whereas I fear that the culture is one of papering over the cracks and not recognizing the challenge. I think we really do need to recognize the challenge, deal with it, rather than.
And recognizing that there is a problem, taking on the recommendations of the report, would you have any reservations now that the report will be read, it'll be put on the shelf?
In fairness to the government and to the officials in the Department of Environment, we Department of Housing, and regularly involved in groups that debate with them and discuss with them. I think one change I've noticed in the last 3 or 4 years, I think there's a lot more unanimity about the direction of travel. I mean, I would probably be in the wing that would say we need to do more things, but I do recognize that the changes that have been made in the last year are significant and will make a difference. The point I was making today was the challenge is greater than is being recognized. I don't believe that the target is 50,000, and that had already been put up. I think the figures from the SRI at 80,000 or Davies at 93 are probably, and John O'Connor touched on it and O'Flynn touched on it, this divergence. I think we need to recognise the target figure. Either way, it's a long-term challenge. And I showed in my charts today that this plan is going to run to 2040, perhaps 2050. But that's not unique in Europe. In the post-war period, Sweden had a million house plan from the mid-60s to the mid-70s. They declared that front as a problem, and they said how they were going to do it. And I think that's the sort of initiative we need to take.
Mm-hmm. And going forward now, we're talking about these long-term future plans. Do you ever see Ireland adopting a more UDZ rather, model?
I do. I am actually. I sense that there's a general recognition from kind of a diverging areas that we need to do it.
Mm-hmm.
We think the challenge for us will be to do it.
A culture needs to be changed.
There's a culture change required, and there's a commitment required. As I've said, now the only way I see it happening is that we outsource to get help for our local authorities. But I think if they did, let me put it this way, I often go back to the example of Ireland in the mid-80s. We had a situation in Ireland which all our cities were run down. Dublin was run down, but a series of government initiatives, from the IFSC and the Dublin Docklands Development Authority, Temple Power, it changed the perception of Ireland in the world. It initially grew the financial service centre, but the bigger impact was as a result of Temple Bar, the then policy of the government that really through the early 2000s was to go to 9 other centres around the country, which was not a very wise centre. I think Athlone, Letterkenny and Tralee were also included. So all of the incoming knowledge industry companies were brought to all these places, but they would end up coming back to Dublin after the tour.
Mm-hmm.
And an awful lot of them ended up saying, why aren't we going to this city? This seems like because they saw Temple Bar, they saw a lively young city. So I suppose I am equally confident that other Irish cities, whether it be Cork, Limerick, Waterford, Sligo, could equally deliver. And with better planning, greater initiatives, those things could happen. I mean, my colleagues and I were debating it recently. We were saying we need kind of lateral thinking. And one of them, this hasn't been tested financially, by the way, but I'll tell you anyway. The talk about expanding Dublin Airport, a much more interesting thing would be to have a very, very fast train as per the European model to Limerick, Galway, but with a spur to Ciaran. So if you knew you could go to or up to Shannon in 35 minutes, as opposed to cross Dublin City, probably in an hour, you probably would choose to do it. But that would have other impacts in that it would help grow Limerick, Cork, Galway, Shannon. This is gut reaction and gut instinct. It obviously has to be tested, but I think we need more of that kind of forward planning, lateral thinking type approach to our culture. And I think it was equally improbable that Ireland could have had an international financial services centre in Dublin. Definitely was improbable that Ireland could have had could be one of the knowledge cities of the world, competing at the highest level in Europe. But that came from wise government decisions implemented.
Plenty to think about there in terms of our future direction, in terms of planning, in terms of architecture, in terms of the housing situation, any solutions, recommendations that will hopefully lead to solutions. Tony Reddy, the chairman of Reddy Architecture and Urbanism, thank you very much. And a very warm thank you to Tony Reddy, founder and chairman of Reddy Architecture and Urbanism, for this pertinent and thought-provoking conversation. Make sure to join us for next week's episode of Mullooly Matters, where we will gather more insights from Ciaran Mullooly's housing event in Galway, brought to you in association with Renew Europe. Be sure to never miss an episode of Mullooly Matters by following our podcast on YouTube, Spotify and SoundCloud. Until next time, goodbye.